Thank you, Margaret. Welcome, everybody. I wanted to give a brief preamble, then we're going to ask everybody to give a little statement, and then we'll have a conversation, and then we'll let you all participate in the conversation. This program is inspired by Peg Bradley's exceedingly generous act. So she built this wonderful collection of 20th century art, and then she gave it all to the museum. And when she did that, she transformed her hometown museum, but more importantly, she transformed the community. She had a catalytic effect, ripple effects. And in fact, as part of that, she issued a challenge to the museum. She said, you have to build a new building. And this wasn't a vanity project. She didn't want her name on it. She knew we needed a lot of space. And she gave a quarter of the seed money to fund it as well. And at that moment, the conversation went public because there was a question of whether there would be public funds used to pay some of the rest of the money. And debates were held in the pages of the newspapers. Should the public support art? And in fact, the resounding answer was yes, because of the effects on young people, on older people, the ability of employers to retain and attract talent. The effects were numerous. And when the museum opened the new wing, which is 50 years ago, this past September, the critics raved and they said, now Milwaukee is among its peer cities. It's no longer a way station for art, but it is a destination for art. And so I wanted to bring us together to talk about what people and institutions can do to support and shape the arts ecosystems of our communities. And I picked 3 of the best minds I could think of. And I want to invite each of them to make a little statement about what they're doing to support their own arts ecosystems. Fortunately, they've sat in alphabetical order, so we'll do Rob, Abby, Greg.
Great. Well, thank you, Liz. Thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks to MAM for putting on this discussion. So you can see the title of my very brief presentation, and I hesitate a little because I don't want to just convey gloom, doom, challenges. There's a lot of very exciting stuff going on in our arts community in Milwaukee, a lot of very impressive recent achievements. I feel confident we'll get to those. But former Mayor Barrett once labeled me as Milwaukee's buzzkill. And so I'm afraid that I'll perhaps live up to that moniker, at least for 8 slides. So I'm going to speak briefly for both of the roles. My previous role as the longtime president of the Wisconsin Policy Forum and a co-author of the report that you're now seeing on the screen behind me, as well as my more recent role and current role as the executive director of the Hertzfeld Foundation. So this is the cover of a report that the forum released in the spring of 2024. We were commissioned by the Northwestern Mutual Foundation and Bader Philanthropies and the Hertzfeld Foundation, for which I did not work at the time, to sort of do a level set on the challenges facing the performing arts sector coming out of the pandemic. And we're obviously going to cover the whole sector here, but I think many of the lessons that we wrote about do have relevance to the entire sector. So I'm just going to show you a couple of slides summarizing some of the key findings of this report that I think are most relevant to our conversation this evening. First of all, as we looked back, and we just looked at a 10-year period, the most recent data that was reliable in 2024 was 2022 data, and that skewed things a little bit because we were still not fully recovered from the pandemic. And we looked at 3 years. And so if you just look at 3 individual years, if somebody's doing a capital campaign in a given year, it's going to skew their data. But what this is showing you is the 6 UPATH cornerstones, arguably our 6 largest performing arts organizations in Milwaukee. And clearly one of the things that we were able to document was how program service revenue had declined over time as a percentage of total revenue for these arts organizations. And I think this is something that even we started to see because the policy forum had first really dug into this issue back in 2013. We had started to see well before 2012, just increasing challenges maintaining as part of the revenue pie the earned revenue, the revenue that was generated from admissions and from sales of beverages and other items at venues, and in the case of some like the ballet through educational programming, that just over time the ability to sustain that had declined. And so what did that mean? Well, the good news is we have an extremely generous philanthropic community here in Metro Milwaukee that has very generously supported the arts. And so as earned revenue percentage declined, contributed income mostly through the form of philanthropic foundations from individuals or philanthropic donations from individuals, foundations, and corporations, that was a growing percentage of most of the group's income. And why is that important? Why is that relevant? Again, this is partly a good news and a bad news story, that local philanthropy has stepped up over time as other important critical sources of revenue had actually started declining. But a key question emerged. How long could that continue? Could that be sustained? And if indeed audiences were going to be slow to rebound and perhaps never rebound fully from the pandemic, to what extent could we still count on philanthropy to be able to increasingly fill gaps? And so there were really three overriding issues then. So that was our deep dive into data. We also did dozens of key informant interviews, and three themes emerged there, which I'll talk about very, very briefly. There's this real tension, and that certainly still exists today, and perhaps even more so than when this report was released 18 months ago. Tension between capital campaigns that are being conducted by many different arts organizations in Milwaukee, and the need and desire to contribute to those campaigns. Some of them are traditional capital campaigns for bricks and mortar projects, others are endowment campaigns. Arguably, they're equally important, and from the perspective of local philanthropy, there's a desire to support these, but it really does come into conflict with the urgent plea for help on the operating side by so many arts organizations. For the performing arts, this is not as relevant to MAM, but the future of UPAF has certainly been an item of discussion. Is UPAF still can it still maintain the capacity to serve the purpose that it was created to serve, to both generate workplace giving and to be sort of the arbiter that can determine how both workplace giving donations and corporate donations can be distributed among the different groups? Had UPAF outlived its usefulness, and should UPAF perhaps be expanded to include the entire sector? Should we look at an arts model and not just a performing arts model that could include entities like the Milwaukee Art Museum? And finally, and you've I'm sure seen this, heard this, this was 2023. I think we're now up to 48th instead of 50th. Not because our per capita state funding has increased, but because a couple other states have completely eliminated their state funding for the arts. But one of the reasons that philanthropy increasingly over time has been called upon to fill the gap is because we really don't do a lot in terms of public funding for the arts. Now, there's some good news here too. There have been some very impressive capital commitments in recent years to the Milwaukee Public Museum, to the REP, for example, by state government on the capital side, which is a change. And so this isn't, again, all gloom and doom, but when we take a look, what this is showing you is per capita state funding for the arts. Not only were we number 50 in 2023, but you can see how we compared to our Midwestern peers. So just two more slides, very quickly, turning now to my Hertzfeld hat. you don't have to be Alan Greenspan to really be able to understand the challenge facing small to medium sized foundations like the Hertzfeld Foundation. So what I'm showing you here is, this is our budget for grant making. We have our, we go into the year, so in this case, we went into 2026 with an estimate that we would have $73 million in assets. We aim to distribute at minimum 5% of that. We also have operating expenses that has to come out of that. And so we have about a $3 million annual budget for grant making. And roughly half of that, a little more than half of that, supports arts and culture in Milwaukee. And so we're a small foundation. You're going to hear from Greg, and GMF, of course, is much, much bigger than Hertzfeld. There are bigger foundations, but we are one of the largest supporters of the arts, particularly when it comes to operating grants. And so we have $3 million. Now, hopefully that asset estimate, maybe we were too conservative, and if the stock market continues to do well, we'll have a little bit more money to spend this year. But this is what we have. We don't want to, if at all possible, dive into our principal, because it's the earnings from that principal that allows us to make these investments. Very busy chart here. You don't need to look at all of it, but what I'm trying to illustrate here is, so we have made, and this preceded me, some very generous capital commitments. We are one of the largest foundation donors to the new Milwaukee Public Museum building, and we gave the biggest gift in our history, a $5 million gift to the Repertory Theater's renovated complex. We've made some other capital grants that you're seeing here. We have commitments in place. And the bottom line is that if we were to decide to take part in additional capital campaigns, we would have a problem. As it is, we were able to take some of the profits we've made in recent years from very healthy stock markets, put those aside, and not have what we're doling out every year to fulfill our capital pledges, not have it come out of that $3 million annual grant-making portfolio. But beginning in 2028, if we can't put away more money off the top, we're going to have to eat into that $3 million to the tune of about $500,000 a year. And this doesn't count other capital campaigns that are just getting off the ground, to which we're going to want to contribute. Wink, wink. One of those is from an entity where we happen to be sitting today. But even if nothing else materializes, we would face the challenge of having to take $500,000 a year out of that $3 million. Now, we also happen to be, just using MAM as an example, we give $100,000 to $140,000 a year of operating support to the Milwaukee Art Museum. So if we had to go and make this cut across the board, we might have to take $25,000 or so a year away from MAM. And so that we don't want to do that. And that would hurt. And it's bad enough that we can't increase our annual operating grant every year to organizations like the Art Museum, because obviously their costs are increasing. So this just illustrates the conundrum that we face in trying to sort out the requests that we get between operating support and capital grants. And I'm sorry if I took a little too long, but I will stop there and turn it over to Abby. And do you need the clicker?
No, thank you.
Okay.
I'll pass on.
Hi, everyone. Oh, okay. I'm Abby Pucker. Mine will not. I just can't compete with all of the data. I don't have a slideshow or slides. I realized maybe I should make slides in the future. But so essentially, I wear two hats. So I started a company about 4 years ago called Gertie, named after Gertrude Stein, sort of like a little fun young version of Gertrude Stein, who did these sort of famous salons in her, in her living room. And her whole thing was about bringing different kinds of people together, bringing poets together with academics, together with, visual artists, and sort of the exchange of ideas, and what that contributed to in terms of cross-cultural collaborations, obviously, is pretty historic. I'm from Chicago, born and raised in Chicago, went to school in New York, and then bounced back and forth between New York and LA for about 8 years after graduating college. and I always sort of worked on the partnerships and business development side of cultural companies. So I worked at a talent agency in LA, I worked at an auction house in New York, I worked at a production company, so not philanthropy. So all sort of the commercial side of these cultural industries. And when I moved back to Chicago, I was sort of curious as to why there wasn't sort of a tangible sort of hub or place where I could understand the pulse of what was happening culturally in the city. Like I felt like there was in New York and to a lesser extent LA when I lived in both those places. And so I'm a very solutions-oriented person, so I kind of went on a listening tour in Chicago, talked to a lot of people. I talked to producers, I talked to artists, I talked to galleries, people who ran institutions, curators, and funders, and just kind of tried to understand where were their issues that I could address, and a lot of the problems seemed to be very solvable. In that I think a lot of the problems that I saw were due to a lack of connectivity and a lack of sort of translation between certain communities, so artists, makers, builders, and resources, which I think is the case in a lot of places. And so I kind of set out to try to solve that in lots of different ways. And I'd say the first 2.5 years of the company's sort of history was just throwing things against the wall and seeing what stuck. So we produced a book that was sort of a recipe book and a guidebook to the city of Chicago. And the goal with that was we reached out to 26 people in food space, music, visual art, business, and they were ranging from people like Vic Mensa, who has some platform and notoriety, to like a business person that most people in Chicago that are my age and in the arts probably would have no idea who they were. But the goal was to show that you don't have to be an artist and you don't have to be in the know to participate in the cultural ecosystem where you live, and that everyone has a role to play. And so we basically sent a prompt to these 26 people, and the prompt was, what makes you feel full in your head and your heart and your stomach? And so the format of the book ended up being a spiral-bound sort of, looks like, if my old Jewish grandmother cooked, that would be sort of the recipe book that she would have had. She didn't cook. But sort of plaid on the front and in like fun font and very engaging. We worked with a grad student at IIT to do the mapping, so we had a map for everyone's submission. We had all the addresses of the places that they recommended, and then they wrote a short sort of narrative of, kind of a love letter to their version of Chicago. And they also had a recipe. So from the start, Gertie was about putting content out that helped people find their way through the city from a cultural perspective, and kind of meeting people where they were at. So I think the price point was $35 for the book. So that could be either a starter coffee table book for someone who doesn't have the budget to buy a big, coffee table book, or it could be an actual recipe book that someone used, So it was a lot of different things, different people, and we ended up selling over 1,500 copies, and we self-published it, and so it was kind of the first thing that we did to kind of test the ground and see was there interest in this. And there was interest. It was at the MCA, it was at actually Gagosian in New York, had at the Astor Gates show, and they sold them there, so it kind of made its way around. But all of that to say that what I realized is that people wanted connection, and people felt like they really needed a sort of hand to hold, to take them through. And that's why curators are so important in so many ways. But we found that each institution had their own groups, but there wasn't really a group that was curating the experience of Chicago and doing education, but not having it not feel like education, having it feel like a way that you could really interact. So we started our membership about 2 years ago, and that's really been the sort of financial engine for the company. So we have a basic level of membership that's $600 a year, $55 a month, and we do 2 events every month. I have an amazing woman named Chanel Lacey, who used to be a director at a gallery in Chicago, who runs it, and it kind of all has gone from there. So we do something called Chicago Exhibition Week every year in the fall. This year it's September 14th to 20th, so mark your calendars, come to Chicago. But really what it is like we're galvanizing and sort of coordinating galleries, institutions, artists to just know that things are happening on this weekend. We produce a big exhibition. We align with other institutions and what they're doing. Galleries now know to do certain shows during that time, and then they all do the programming, and we really provide the marketing, the storytelling, the audience, and the wayfinding. So if I had slides, they would be the website that we've created for Chicago Exhibition Week, which lists all 50-plus galleries and institutions that are participating in the weekend, with a page on each, and then we do curated routes, which really comes from the book and what we started doing. So that if you want to do Vic Mensa's route, or you want to do Steph Prim's route, who has an amazing store, you know, you can do that and put yourself in their shoes and see the city through their eyes. So that's really what we're doing, and trying to platform these amazing people in the city and connect them directly with new audiences.
So I'll try to be brief and get us to the question and answer, which is what I know most people want to be able to hear. Greg Wesley, President and CEO of the Greater Milwaukee Foundation. Just as background, the foundation has been around for about 110 years, serving this region. We're the state's largest community foundation, have assets of about $1.2 billion, and that is due to generous donors who had foresight and trust in wanting to make sure that their interests were invested in long after they were gone. And our ability to do that makes me popular in some instances, also makes me not so popular, because while that number is large, it cannot be able to support everything. So it goes across the arts, it goes across basic needs, it goes into higher education. So you just think about it on a regular basis. And while Rob is very factual, he's one of my favorite people, because he's able to make sure that people understand that while large numbers seem large, we need greater solutions to community issues. We at the foundation have a deep history in supporting the arts. And we understand that the creative community matters, and we try to show up as much as we can, whether it's on the operating side, the capital side, the endowment side. We also try to convene what I like to call honest discussions, because what tends to happen is ideas happen, and then you because you want to be able to make something happen, it may not be the right thing to happen. So we have a convening platform for those dialogues to take place. And in particular in this community, we have to continue to convene around the importance of what will be the additional model for supporting the arts. Philanthropy, as well as the corporate community, does support the arts at a disproportionate rate and almost an unsustainable rate for us to be able to continue to be the type of community that people desire us to be. But anyway, I don't want to be the buzzkill from that perspective, but the reality is we do understand that arts leads to regional vitality, and we try to demonstrate that with our funding and also through convening, and also we have done that with our ability to display art, and I'll talk about that and how we've done it with our building. Deep history in supporting the arts, and you can see some of the numbers up on the screen as well. I think I may have passed that. Let me see if I can go back to that. So that number there shows you kind of where we've been, about $56 million in arts over a 5-year period. And then I want to point to what we've been able to do by highlighting the arts as it relates to the foundation. We entered into a collaboration with the Medical College of Wisconsin back in 2017. The foundation moved its offices to a building called the Gimbel Schuster's Building on King Drive, redeveloped that building in partnership with the medical college, and then basically committed to the first floor being open to the public. And on that first floor, we commissioned about 20 artist groups who sat with community, and then were able to reflect back to community what they heard. And it's just a fantastic place that demonstrates that artists matter, and that it can create what I like to call a different kind of buzz around what a community looks like. And not only does it do that, it also helps to produce these types of discussions that you're having here today, because it creates this, I like to call, honest broker kind of conversation about art can mean different things to different people, but it contributes to a community in such a unique way. And then on the last point I want to make, and it's not a slide, we have the Mary Noel Fund at our foundation. And it was a bequest, about $9.6 million when it came, and it's still producing the ability to support artists in this community. Last count was about 414 artists have been able to receive funding due to her foresight. 56 artists exhibitions have been produced on that, and it was because of people like Mary Noel that we can have the kind of conversations we're going to have tonight, and then allows us to be able to support capital campaigns, also support endowments, also to support operating, and also really push into the community the importance that art plays in the direction of a region. So I'll stop there, and thank you for being here tonight, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Well, just so we kind of get all on the same page, let me start by asking you all, what do you think defines a healthy or even a thriving ecosystem for the arts? It could be Chicago, Milwaukee, Paris in the 1920s.
I'll take it maybe less from the artist perspective. I think what defines it is having the appropriate balance, the way that from a funding perspective. And, you know, it's more than about money, but money is important. And right now, we in this community, I really think that we have to have a discussion about what the public model will be to support the arts. Because unless tomorrow I receive, you know, a call from a wealthy person that just, you know, I don't know about, and it's my job to know and to be a resource if that person wants to be a part of it, we won't be able to do the things we want to do in this community. Rob, me, Bader Philanthropies, Cole, you can name them. We know we have a responsibility, but that responsibility and demand is so high, and rightfully so, that we must come up with a solution from a public standpoint to support the arts, to do a couple of things. Not only fund it, but also to inspire artists to want to continue to be here. Because while I won't call any names, there are people here who support the foundation that, you know, have a deep passion for the arts. You can only go to them so much. So I just think we have to have that additional conversation about what a public funding aspect looks like to create the three pieces of the pie, in my opinion.
Do you want to go? You can go ahead. I mean, I have some hot takes. So I didn't even talk about the other hat that I opened with, but I also have we have a family foundation called the Pritzker-Pucker Family Foundation, which Liz's sister-in-law, Val, actually runs, which was a very funny coincidence. We fund largely violence prevention work and community wellness in Chicago and have been for 30 years. That problem has gotten way more difficult and prevalent in some ways and decreased in some ways, and I think it shows how long it takes to really change things that are super structurally embedded. It also has showed me that philanthropy sometimes doesn't help solve issues. It helps continue to put Band-Aids on things. And I think that we really need to think about what should philanthropy be funding versus what should be an LLC or what should be a C Corp. I think creative businesses need to be, really need to be considered within the arts ecosystem. Creative small business, I think, is a huge part of the solution. And I think we need to find more ways for, to not just rely on those large gifts from people who either want to use philanthropy as a tax strategy, which that's fine, or are doing it sort of out of the goodness of their heart. Arts philanthropy is decreasing nationally, and the federal funding from this administration also is decreasing rapidly, and also education funding, and so a lot of those things generally are very intertwined. And so when you have all of that happening, I think what we need to do is find new models and new ways of creating a more distributed support system for institutions, for artists, for all of these things. So instead of focusing on a couple of really large, donors and sort of generational wealth, I think we need to start looking at strategies to build a public that is more generally supportive.
So I guess what I would just briefly add, when I think about a thriving ecosystem, I think about diversity in terms of the types of things, amenities that we're offering. I may not be a big fan of the opera, but I'm a huge fan of art, visual art, and so mix of visual, performing, et cetera. But I think one of the points that often sort of gets overlooked, and it ties back to what both Greg and Abby were saying, is the role that both public funding and philanthropic funding plays in ensuring that there is a breadth of offerings in the community, and particularly a breadth that offers affordable options for people. Unfortunately, not all of us can afford to go to the symphony or to the Rep, and admissions to our largest museums are unaffordable to some, and that not taking away from the free days. And MAM is so fortunate to have a donor who allows children under 12 to come here for free. But where public sector funding can really make a difference, and once upon a time, Milwaukee County owned a lot of the key cultural institutions here, and that public ownership and funding kept those amenities affordable to the general public. And so, to me, a thriving ecosystem is one that also offers all sorts of levels of affordability.
All right, there are like 8 different follow-up questions I want to ask, but Abby, let me start with you. So you're taking a more entrepreneurial approach and really leaning into building audiences, because we could have a community of artists, but if there's nobody around to consume their works and support their works, then what do they do? So how do you build an audience, and especially how do you build an audience of a younger generation in a post-COVID era?
I think, who knows? I think just trying things is better than trying to get to the perfect answer. But I do feel like, so our membership includes, and a lot of the programming that we do and the partnerships that we do within the membership or outside of that during Chicago Exhibition Weekend or during Expo Chicago are with visual art, but also performing arts. So we partner with the ballet, we partner with the opera, we partner with the theaters. I'm like, so like Steppenwolf and Goodman and Looking Glass and other theaters like that in the city. So I think, you know, part of what Rob said is like a multiplicity, like a variety and a diversity of options. I think it's really important not to be prescriptive when people are just coming into the arts, right? So I think we have, institutions over the last, 50, 60 years, there's this model of, you know, young patrons groups, and there's this model of, you know, trustees and boards, and there's certain sort of access or entitlements provided to each of those different groups. To me, I think a lot of that stuff should just be like baseline what people should be getting out of the experience. But I also think that people should have to pay for those things because they don't just exist. And so I think training people to understand that, you know, this stuff takes money, and also talking about all of that is really important. But to me, it's about giving people agency and choice, and not telling them, okay, show up to this thing where you're gonna go and sort of like feel uncomfortable and not really know what to do. But instead, it's like, come to this place that happens to have art. You're gonna meet people that you're interested in meeting. We're gonna connect you, we're gonna put you together. I think sometimes like the art world feels like everything is about the object, or everything is like about what they value. And I think, you know, meeting people where they're at is really important. And so trying to understand, what do new audiences want out of being together? And I think a lot of people also assume that, you know, young people just want to sit on their phones or behind a screen. And what I've seen is that that's not true. I think it's actually really hard for a lot of young people post-pandemic to understand how to interact with other people, which sounds really crazy. I'm super extrovert, and so for me it's sort of like breathing. But for a lot of people it's not. And so not just, you know, providing the program is not enough. There's so many points at which people aren't comfortable, or if they're gonna decide between going to something and not going to something, they're gonna choose not going because they don't know what to wear. Like, I've heard so many people say, well, what should I wear? So I think making things really clear, I mean, it sounds crazy, right? But like, it's true. Like, and people are gonna, you know, they think they're gonna be judged, or if they ask a question, they think that, oh, they're gonna look uneducated, or there's so many decision points. And so I think just trying to make it as like informal and friendly and not pejorative, I think, as possible is the best way to do that, and to understand what they want out of it, and then try to get on their level.
From my perspective, I think it's a couple of things. I think you have to have partnerships with organizations that actually have credibility across multiple sectors in this community. And this will sound like an infomercial, but it's factual. A community foundation is like, that's exactly what we do. And I think you have to have those types of partnerships so we can go to folks in a way and say, we know that representation matters, we know that engagement matters, we're going to create a space for access, and guess what, you're going to enjoy it, and you get connected. And we can also have conversations about what I call the fundamentals, which is the population size. The reason that you should be participating as young people is that our community needs you, and we can factually show the numbers. 1.6 million people, we want you to stay, and you are going to be critical and valuable to the vibrancy of a community going forward. So that's a way I think you do it, and you partner with organizations that folks will be comfortable having a conversation with, and you can help them to get over some of the things that Abby talked about. Will I be judged? You know, what should I wear? How should I look? And it's just, I call it creating that space that back in the day, it was like if you saw more than what your day-to-day was looking like, it inspired you to want to do other things. And I think we have to get back to some of those basics, but ma'am can't do it. because you have to focus on the day-to-day. So you got to create partnerships with folks that will create that space, in my opinion.
And Greg, you actively created a space, with Thrive on King that combines physical health, mental health, and visual arts and food.
I didn't do it by myself. Yeah. We did. That's right.
Right, and community, and really meeting people, again, Abby, as you say, where they are. That seems like a fundamental part.
Yes, we did, and we did it with the intention of centering community voice, and then we reflected back to them what they heard from community. And you'd be surprised how much people want to actually be heard. It's surprising to me that when you intentionally talk to community and you convene them, and I call it actually delivering on what you say, how much they will then gravitate back to you. And that's one thing that we were fortunate to be able to do, is to hear and then reflect back visually some of the hopes and dreams and aspirations that people had. And then we set the artists with community members and asked them to interact and say, is this right? Is this what you were talking about? And it really worked. And it gave our local artists a bigger boost. And they've been able to go on to produce works that are larger in our community, and then their networks are learning about Milwaukee and coming back to Milwaukee. So I would just say never underestimate the importance of community voice, and that doesn't mean one community. That's the entire community. I think we have to keep having that conversation, that Milwaukee has multiple communities, and every part of this community should be represented in some way, heard, respected, valued, and supported.
Yes, hear, hear. All right, the time has actually been flying by already. Rob, I'm going to ask you one more wonky question, and then I'm going to ask a question for all of us, and we'll open it up. Okay. Rob, I know you have done some comparisons with other Midwestern states, mostly about their public funding models. Are there just a few takeaways you could share?
Yeah, I think the best example, you saw the slide that I put up earlier, our per capita funding, state funding for the arts here, about 18 cents per person in 2023. You look at Minnesota, and it was, I think, $7.64. So how can that be? Well, Minnesota actually asked its voters, and a referendum was put to the voters to establish a 0.375% sales tax, with the proceeds earmarked for the arts as well as the environment, parks and open space and water and conservation. And the voters said yes, and it's a time-limited tax, so it expires in 2034. It will have to be renewed by voters, or it will go away. But that is what, that source of dedicated funding is what allows Minnesota to provide an ample pool of resources, not only to support its arts and culture, but also its recreation and its open space. And we've had that discussion here for many, many, many years. And I can say this now because I'm no longer the head of a nonpartisan policy think tank, but what has frustrated me so much is, I'm not going to tell you whether, establishing a new sales tax and dedicating that to the arts is something that I personally support or don't support, but I've never been able to reconcile the fact that we refuse to ask the voters what they think about that question. And people don't understand, a tenth of a cent. We used to have a tenth of a cent add-on to our sales tax in the 4-county Southeast Wisconsin region that paid off the debt on American Family Field, formerly Miller Park. And that tax sunset. Well, we could have kept that tax going and used it for other things. And again, I'm not saying this is a big tax and spender, but I don't think anybody really quite recognized that a tenth of a cent sales tax, which would generate, by the way, about $20 million per year in Milwaukee County, is a dime on a $100 purchase. And so I think if you brought the question to the voters, would you be willing to make that type of sacrifice to ensure that we have a thriving arts community in Wisconsin? I don't know. I haven't polled it. I don't know. But I think it would be worth asking them. And we just have not had the will to do that.
All right, well, with that,
challenging math
well, with,
for our legislative elections will solve that problem.
And I won't debate that at all. I actually think that that's accurate. And I also think that we really have to put the arts groups in a room and to hash it out and say that you must be collective in your voice. And I don't want to, I know that might offend some people, but it's the truth. The things that get done in this community have collective voices. And right now, what I've been able to observe is that there is too much division amongst the groups that allow for the voter, I mean not the voters, but the decision makers to stall that conversation about funding.
well, I'm hearing great calls to action. We have an audience of incredible supporters of the arts
Yes.
who've given us their Thursday evening to come hear this conversation, who regularly support the museum and I'm sure many other institutions. And I'm just wondering if we might close out by suggesting to them what's one thing they might do to support the arts ecosystem of their community.
That's a
I mean,
well, I mean, I think continue to have the foresight and the trust, continue to be philanthropic, listen, and I would say also continue to dig deep. But when you are asked to support whatever that idea is, I do think it's super important to be careful around transformative things, because you want to support it. You do not want to put yourself in a place where you get it built and you don't have the endowment to support it, because then it just takes money from others. So I would say be discerning about where your philanthropic dollars go, whether it's on the capital campaign side or on the endowment side or the operating side, so that you can feel good about your investment, and then you can ask others to support it. But don't give up, because this community needs generous donors and patrons of the art to make this community continue to thrive and be what it is.
shop local. Don't buy things on Amazon. I think that sounds like very silly, but it's actually huge. Like when you think about how much money leaves this local economy, and I mean, I'm guilty of it. I'm sure lots of people are. And it's like, I'm not even saying boo Amazon. I'm saying there's so many local businesses, whether it's restaurants or it's bookshops or it's galleries or, you know, that whether they're nonprofits or not, that are so deeply struggling. And I think for me, it's like just show up and bring like 3 friends. And if you work at a big company, try to get your colleagues to go and also attend these places, because I think that, you know, earned revenue, Rob was talking about earlier, is such an important thing for nonprofits, but you know, sales obviously in a for-profit setting, but like that, you guys showing up and actually like going and buying and spending time and bringing other people along, to me in the long term, I think that's even more transformative than one-time large transformational gift.
Just the one thing that I would add very quickly, and we don't forget about the ecosystem, and that it is an ecosystem, and we all have our favorite venues and institutions that we love and that we support, but yes, shop local and try to spread your dollar to them. But the one piece of the ecosystem I meant to talk about and didn't have time was arts education. And so when I think about the value of our First Stage and MISO and Conservatory and all of the groups out there, and the Art Museum and other big organizations, institutions are obviously in our schools and doing invaluable education as well. But supporting that part so that these next generations coming up have a basis in their schools where they're learning about and appreciating art and using art, of course, to expand their minds is critical.
I know the audience probably has questions. I think we have time for just 2 or 3, if anybody wants. I know, there's a million questions to ask. Okay, I saw you first, yeah?
Rob, you mentioned, oh, Rob, I'm sorry, right. You mentioned just right at the end, you said, some might be offended, but I have to say that there needs to be a collective voice between all of the artists, and there's a lot of division. Is there anything stopping those separate artists from coming together and finding a collective voice? Can you summarize that question?
Yeah, so I do think that that's one. The question was about what's stopping that collective voice, I think is what you were asking. You know, you would have to ask the artist groups, but I just see it and I feel it. And we want to be able to help. We want to be able to create spaces for that collective discussion, but I don't know that there is a belief around the funding model. And I think it's this belief that philanthropy and the corporate sector should do more. The answer is we should do more. But the more we do, in my opinion, based on where I sit and I look at our numbers, the more unsustainable it creates. Because you see it and you love it and you want more. And then, you know, I have to come to some people in this room and ask for more, and that doesn't always go over really well. And then you become, it just creates this shaky will. We must figure out a way to have a public funding model that's going to work. And that may not mean, it may not be increasing taxes, it may be capturing the existing tax base in a community through TIDS or something, but we have to find additional funding that will go to either endowment, operating, something that's going to allow that collective voice where people can share and not feel like they have to elbow fellow artists out in order to get their own.
Do you think with like TIDS, public institutions could benefit from guidance on how to create a sustainable fund?
Yes, I do, and I think we need to spend, when I first got to this community, it used to be folks would go to different places, the community leaders would visit other places and learn from other places. And I would say maybe in the last 10 years, Rob, I'm not sure that's happening anymore. And we have to, I think we need to get back on the road and find out what other communities are doing who are, and it's not a panacea, so everybody's got a problem. But others are, you know, challenging their problems and solving their problems, I think, at a faster rate than us. And I think we need to go visit the communities that are doing it right for 2 reasons: to find out what they're doing well, but also to get some inspiration that it actually can be done. Because what tends to happen is the fatigue sets in. And, you know, when 1 or 2 families step up, and their names are prominently displayed on something, they make that commitment, they want that commitment to go out, but they don't have the ability to do 20 of them. And then that, I just call it that drag starts to happen. So I think we need some inspiration, and we need to find other communities that are doing it well and say to us, what can we bring back to our community that's gonna work? And then put our shoulders to the wheel and make it happen. When I've been in this town long enough, since 1997, to see that when it wants to do something, it happens. We're sitting in it.
Yeah.
the baseball park. It happens. We have to get that will back. And we need some leaders that are willing to lean into it and not say who's going to pay for it.
And there's one last question right here.
Hi. I recognize that the division, or I don't know if the division is the right word, between like arts and the public isn't entirely like go awayable. But like, I'm wondering if any of you have ideas about like average Joe folks and like how they can like, is there room or are there already like more grassrootsy organizations focusing on the arts in Milwaukee or other cities? And do you think there's a potential for that being of any use?
I'm going to try to restate it with a long question, but basically, how can we relate to everyday folks, average Joe folks, in the arts?
And are you asking specifically about specific groups that are maybe doing that work? I don't know Milwaukee as well as many other people do. I think everyone should just spend a day with John Rubenhoff, who I had the pleasure of spending the day with, and he could answer that question for you.
Who wears multiple hats as a gallerist, an artist, and head of Sculpture Milwaukee.
And just a wonderful human being who has a lot of amazing ideas and is also a doer and not just an ideas person, which I really appreciate. But I think it's an interesting question because I think that there's two types of groups sort of in the arts from what I understand and from what my experience is, especially in like a philanthropic setting. One is appealing to people who have higher than average household incomes, right? People who are donors, people who are, high net worth individuals, right? That's one group. And then there is, a lot of organizations, which is an amazing thing, that work with, youth, right? Or people who are from areas, at least in Chicago, that are, disinvested of, right? There's a lot of those two extremes, but I think that the middle is kind of the place that not enough people are looking. And I think it's one of the hardest things to solve. And it's, part of what we're trying to do is figure out how do you do that, right? I think that like the Chicago Reader, for instance, is an alt weekly in Chicago, just got acquired by a national organization that's really wonderful, that has a really cool mixed nonprofit, for-profit model. And I think partnering with, and you talked about Greg partnership too, partnering with people who have a reach to those sort of like everyday or, average Joe people, right? And giving them sort of the option to participate is, so media, I think, is maybe what I'm saying, is like supposed to be that. And I think we have a crisis of local journalism in this country. And so I think, whereas that used to be a place where a lot of people could go to participate, to know what's going on, to find community, it's not as much anymore. And I think, what I'm trying to do, I think, is try to be part of that solution, but I don't know if there is a good solution. And I think it's a really important question.
Well, I'm going to leave it there. I think we can all be part of the solution here. I want to thank my wonderful panelists. I want to thank all of you for showing up tonight and for showing up every day. Thanks, everybody. Good night.